So again, welcome to today's topic, which is a very cheery one on a sunny day, the importance of accepting death and loss. But it is, again, as we'll see, a very important topic for us to spend some time thinking about every day if we can. So I'm going to start with just the meditation. I think last week we did the meditation first. I think it's kind of nice to do just a very short meditation. Some of you have already come in for the morning meditation prior to this. So let's just spend just a few minutes doing a little bit of a focus meditation first, just focusing on the breath. Give ourselves a chance to come into this space, to be present with each other. And then I'll come in just a minute or two and we'll set our motivation together. So now let's set our motivation for today's session. Again, this topic of death, having loss in our lives, is a reality, one that we need to be aware of. And we see that the main importance, as we'll be exploring today, is so that we actually use this life meaningfully, so that we actually do something with the time that we have before it's too late, before this life comes to an end. So we take the opportunity that we have right now, these few minutes of setting our motivation, to remind ourselves of the meaning of life. We're all here to work on ourselves, to accomplish the goals that the Buddha taught, the ability for us to gain a good rebirth after this life, the ability for us to become free of the cycle of existence, not having to go from life to life. But the greatest goal and the greatest ability we all possess, the ability to become fully enlightened, to become a Buddha, to accomplish our deepest potential so that we then can lead other beings to do the same. So again, this is the ideal motivation that we want to bring to our time together and that we want to bring to every moment of our lives, all the way into our death. The aspiration to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings, bodhicitta. So try to set that motivation for our time together so that everything we do becomes very meaningful, very purposeful. And you can open your eyes fully and we'll do a short prayer together. Again, we're just doing this one prayer before we begin the prayer of refuge, which also includes the thought of bodhicitta, that we're here with some confidence in the three jewels as what will lead us all the way to the state of enlightenment, and that we're going to listen to the Dharma in order to accomplish that goal. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok. Okay, again, it's good to be with all of you this morning. Our second session in this month that I'm with you on Sundays. And so, again, last week we spent some time talking about fostering harmony and community. Today we're moving to a very different topic. But as I said in the before we began, this is one of the most important ones. It's in terms of the Lam Rim, it's set out towards the beginning because it really becomes the impetus for us to use this life or meaningfully in a meaningful way. Let's go ahead and I've got prepared a few little slides for today. I want to start with just a quote from the Buddha from the transmission of the Vinaya, where he says, all collections end up running out. The high end up falling. Meeting ends in separation. Living ends in death. Of course, just kind of setting it out right there in front of us, the bare reality that we all have to face up to, that there is nothing that is certain within this existence, and everything will eventually end in our death, and it's being separated from the things that we love and so on. I want to share one other quote that comes from, it's quoted in Geshe Sopa's commentaries on the Lamrim Chenmo in the very first volume. It's a quote, though, from Karmapa Sherpa. He says, we should be afraid of death right now. At the moment of death, we should be fearless. But we get it backward. We are not frightened right now, but at the moment of death, we beat our breasts in fear. So this kind of gets into this whole idea again that Lama Zopa Rinpoche even published a book that was called Wholesome Fear. You know, today is kind of looking at this topic that there can be a lot of fear around, a lot of trepidation when we look at the topic of death. I think our society as a whole has really been blinded to the reality of death in our current age, at least. Everything I hear from my parents about when they were growing up and what have you, it seemed like death was a little bit closer to home. But we've gotten to a time where we can shield ourselves to some degree from death. Now, during the pandemic, these last 2 years, we certainly saw that we had death in our face a lot more than what we would normally do. Perhaps, through having the levels of mortality that were going on around the illness and what have you. But for most of us, we still do try to kind of keep our blinders on and not really look at the topic of death and dying. So it is important that we develop this sense of wholesome fear. We can say fear has kind of two dimensions to it. One might be where it does become a bit irrational, and it's something that we don't really need to have a fear of. Remember, there's that wonderful quote from Master Shantideva in his sixth chapter where he says, if there's something that is sort of askew or faulty, what's the point of getting worried about it if you can do something about it? And then the other side of it, if it is something that would normally make you worried, well, if you can't do anything about it, then your worry becomes useless. So we have to look at the idea of a fear that is irrational around death, that is simply panicking because we are facing the inevitable end of this life, isn't really that rational, because we can't do anything about the reality of death. But what we can do something about, what Master Shantideva is saying in the first part, that if there is something we can actually kind of invest in and spend some time looking at, well, then maybe perhaps we can approach our death in a very different way. This is what Rinpoche calls wholesome fear, where we kind of acknowledge that there is this thing on the horizon, and it doesn't become, again, this elevated, anxious, stressful fear. It becomes a working fear, something that we understand is going to happen, and therefore we need to invest some time into looking at this topic and being mindful of it, being aware of it. So these are the sorts of things we're going to be looking at today, is to kind of what are the things that, first of all, emphasize the importance of doing this type of meditation, because that's the main topic, but also what are the sorts of reflections that will be a benefit to us. And we have to start preparing now for our death if we haven't already. Many of you hopefully already have some practice and some mindfulness of death that kind of you've instituted into your life, that has infused every day of your life, hopefully with great meaning and purpose then. But it is up to each of us to work with this topic and to extract the essence of it. So let me go ahead and kind of one of the things I want to mention before we go too far into the teachings is that this topic of death is usually presented within the greater topic of what is called impermanence. Impermanence is referring to the fact that everything changes, at least all these things that are produced from causes and conditions, including this very body. Of course, when we talk about death, we're mostly talking about the inability of the body to be able to continue to sustain this life. So this body was born from causes and conditions, from two cells of your parents that were united in the womb of your mother, that began to replicate and became this body that has a continuity that goes all the way back to that moment of time. But it's been constantly changing. And of course, over time, aging occurs and so on. But this is the reality of everything that is produced. Everything that is caused is continually, momentarily changing. So that's the subtle level of impermanence that's going on all around us all the time. And of course, we're quite blind to that as well. What we're going to talk about today is, again, this subset of that, which we usually refer to as gross impermanence, a coarser form of impermanence, which is when things actually go out of existence, because that does happen to many things. Our mind is an impermanent phenomenon, but our mind never goes out of existence. Of course, grosser levels of consciousness will, when we get to the end of this life, when we sort of shed this human rebirth and go on to our next existence. But all of the continuity of awareness is there. Mind is subject to impermanence, but not gross impermanence. Whereas this body, as I was saying, is subject to gross impermanence as well as subtle impermanence. It's changing all the time, and it will eventually, cease to be our body. It will cease to be the sort of container for our consciousness within this existence. So this is what is happening with regard to death, is it's a form of impermanence that is much more in our face. Again, much easier to see in some ways than subtle impermanence, but nonetheless, we do tend to have a sort of blindness to it. I want to share a little quote that I really appreciated. Joan Halifax Roshi, she's actually was very involved and still continues to be involved in Upaya Zen Center here in Santa Fe. And she wrote a book called Being with Dying. And she does a lot of work around helping people to, in the caregiving profession, to work with those who are dying. And then towards the beginning of this book, she says, a few years ago, a dying friend read me some lines from the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. They made me smile. Virtuous King Yudhishthira, who's the son of Yama, the Lord of Death, is asked, "What is the most wondrous thing in the world?" And Yudhishthira replies, "The most wondrous thing in the world is that all around us people can be dying, and we don't believe it can happen to us." This is pretty wondrous. It is pretty um, unbelievable in some ways. But this is the reality. And even again, looking at the last 2 years with the pandemic and with so many people having lost their lives, to this virus, people still tend to think, well, but not me. It's not going to happen to me. At a deep level, sure, we understand that death is a reality, but most people don't live their lives with that level of acceptance. So even the Buddha himself, the story of Prince Siddhartha is an interesting one, and maybe is bit more mythical than it is factual. It's hard to say, but as many of you know, Prince Siddhartha was, prophesied to be a great spiritual kind of teacher and would be doing all sorts of wonderful things. But the king, his father, decided he wanted to keep him in the castle and the palace walls and not allow him to see anything that would cause him to go in that direction, to search for spiritual meaning and what have you. So he sort of made the life at the palace ideal, where the Buddha, the Prince Siddhartha, always had everything around him, everything that he needed. And so he never thought that there was any problem with sort of the mundane pleasures of this world. Well, the story goes that there was a kind of a wandering minstrel that came through the palace who was speaking about all these interesting places, in different parts of the world. And Prince Siddhartha got very curious. He says, "Well, what's beyond these palace walls?" And so he really begged his father to allow him to, go outside the palace walls. And so his father, King Shuddhodana, I think is his name. Anyway, the father decided that he would allow him to do this, but he would, kind of put everything in the perfect shape so that everywhere the Buddha, I keep calling him the Buddha, he is the Buddha, but Prince Siddhartha, everywhere he would go, he wouldn't be seeing anything that was any different from his life in the palace. So he went into a town, and of course, all the people looked really nice. They were all young and beautiful, everyone having a wonderful time. And then suddenly he happens to see someone who is quite aged, who's dealing with old age, who somehow crept into the picture. And of course, this is really disturbing for the Buddha. He's like looking at this and saying, what is going on here? I thought everything was young and beautiful and charming and delightful. And of course, this is aging. This is, what we all have to deal with if we live that long, the body becoming more decrepit, eventually losing its luster and what have you. So he made a second journey out to a town, and the king did the same thing, tried to make it all look perfect. So it was just like life in the palace. But this time, someone who was ill, dealing with a really, ravaging illness that was causing, all sorts of, could see that the change in the body and what have you due to that illness. And so Prince Siddhartha looked at this and he said, "What is this?" And he said, "This is illness, and this happens to everyone as well." And of course, this is more disturbing now for the prince. He's kind of had these two little insights into aging and illness that have shown him that everything isn't all that wonderful and cushy. So he goes out for a third journey, and on his third journey, he actually sees, of course, everyone looking all beautiful and wonderful, but then in the midst of all of it comes a funeral procession. They're carrying a corpse, and he's never seen a corpse before. And so he asks, "What is this? What is going on here?" You know, he says, "Well, this is death. This happens to all of us as well." So in those three sort of visions that he had, looking at, the aging, illness, and death, he became very alarmed. He just couldn't really figure out, well, I thought everything was fine, and now all of a sudden I'm really upset and disturbed because things are not fine. And again, whether this is a actual story or more kind of a way of making the point, the reality was is that he had to realize those three things. He had to have that hit home. He had to have that register at a very deep level for him to go on his spiritual quest. He made a fourth visit out, and in the fourth visit, he actually saw one of these spiritual mendicants, seeker, and he said, "Well, who are you? What's going on here?" And kind of explained what this person was doing, and he said, "That's what I want to do. Then I want to seek a way out of all of this. This is unsatisfactory." Of course, this is something that, as I said, we all have to get our heads around. So we're looking at this today in kind of our own process of trying to accept the reality of these factors that have to do with loss as well as death. Aging is the loss of our vitality, illness, the loss of our health, death, the loss of this life. And this is a reality that we all have to confront. So the Buddhist story tells it, and of course, many of us can tell our own personal stories of how we came to Buddhism through encountering the reality of death, perhaps, or at least, maybe some of you had illness and saw, again, some things that caused you to think about what is it all about, and how do I confront that reality? What I want to start with today are I call this Buddhist advertising. But today is a bit of advertising because the whole thing is around trying to stress the importance of this type of meditation. At the beginning of each Lam Rim book, they generally go into for particular topics, not all of them, but especially this topic, remembering death, recalling death. They give you sort of the disadvantages, the drawbacks of not remembering it, and then they go into the advantages of doing it. So again, it's good advertising from the Buddha because it gives us the impetus then to begin to look at this topic. So the very first drawback or disadvantage is that you won't remember Dharma. If you don't remember the reality of death, you won't remember what we each have got to engage in. That this life does have a great purpose and great meaning, and that is embodied in the Dharma and the teachings of the Buddha. So that'll be the first fallback, is that we won't even remember to practice Dharma because it will keep putting it off, and we think it's not so important, perhaps because we're too preoccupied with life and forgetting that death can come. Secondly, even if you do remember Dharma, you will not practice it. And then third, even if you do practice it, you won't practice it properly. So this idea again, that if we don't have something to sort of put a fire underneath us to get us to engage in practice, well then, we might remember death, but we might forget that that's the reality of what we're trying to accomplish, is to get us to every day wholeheartedly be engaging in whatever Buddhist practice we can. But even if we do remember to practice, our practice may be done still with some worldly motivation. In the section on death and most of the Lam Rim texts, they often talk about in this section what are called the 8 worldly concerns, the mundane concerns. We get preoccupied in trying to attain 4 things and trying to avoid their opposites. And we have a great attachment to kind of keeping everything in that sort of zone where we're getting what we want and not getting what we don't want. On the one hand, we have, the sort of material gain, having nice things in our life and what have you, and we don't want to lose those, right? And then we have, secondly, the comfort, all the things that make us feel good about ourselves, all the pleasurable experiences, comfortable experiences, and we hate discomfort. We hate to experience anything that is kind of not giving us that. Thirdly, we like to have people praise us. We're really quite attached to hearing good things about us, and we don't want the criticism. And then fourthly, we, would like to have a good reputation in the world. People think well of us in general, and we would, hate to have a bad reputation. Again, there may be, some, certainly we can, avoid some of these things on the negative list, having a bad reputation and so on, without it becoming disturbing. But the problem is we live our lives guided by those 8 concerns. All we do throughout every day of our lives is become preoccupied with getting what we want, avoiding what we don't want. This is our default mode. We have to break away from that and actually engage in wholehearted practice. So, and we just saw one of the disadvantages, we won't remember to practice, even though we might remember death. But secondly, if we do remember to practice, we may not practice purely because we may still think that we're practicing for the comforts of this life. And I know some Buddhist practitioners who, when they initially come to the Dharma in particular, think, well, it's all about feeling good right now. And even you engage in some meditation with that purpose. Oh, I want to just have my time and quiet and peace and, shut everything off and what have you. I mean, you do have that effect from doing meditation, but that's not why we meditate. We don't meditate for the peace of this life. We meditate so that we can actually gain realizations and accomplish something meaningful. So again, this is the third point on here. Even if you do practice it, you won't practice properly or purely. And then fourth, your practice will lack persistence. If you don't constantly be mindful of death, you're not going to have this sort of constant, continuous flow of practice that's going to actually accomplish something meaningful with this life. Fifthly, you will still have doorways through which you will have non-virtuous actions occurring. We may not be able to completely shut the door to that because we won't be thinking about death and the reality of what happens at death and the need to be attentive to the actions that we create with this life. And then the last one, unfortunately, if we don't remember death throughout this life, it's most likely that we will die with great regrets. Having had this wonderful opportunity of being in this human existence and then getting to our deathbed and recognizing that we didn't do anything that meaningful or purposeful with it. They often compare this to the idea of being taken to an island of jewels. If you can imagine such a place where there's like all these jewels to be mined, and all we have to do is put the effort into doing it. And say you spend your month or 2 months there on this island of jewels, but then you walk away empty-handed. You didn't take a single thing with you. Well, then, that would be pretty, meaningless when it comes to gathering wealth, through accumulating jewels and what have you. And it's the same with regard to this human existence. We're here for a short time. We have this wonderful human opportunity. Do we actually take advantage of it? Do we do what we need to do with this life? So again, don't die with regrets. Actually recall death. Make every day of your life meaningful. So let's go on to the other side of it, which is some of these are kind of really, very close in terms of being the flip side of what we saw, but others aren't. First of all, your actions become most beneficial when we think about death and recall death. Well, then we set aside the other non-virtuous actions and things that we might engage in, and we focus on what is beneficial at this time. How do we actually use this day in a more purposeful way? Secondly, your practice becomes most powerful. The things that you actually do when you are under the influence of this mindfulness of death have great power to them. There's just a force that comes with them that is kind of, again, comparable to, say, again, you go to this island of jewels and you have this set period of time that you're going to be there. Well, if you know that your being there is to collect as many jewels as you can so you can take them with you when you leave, well, then you're going to put great effort into it, right? You're not going to spend your time lounging on the beach or doing whatever. You're just going to say, okay, I'm here to accumulate jewels. I want the wealth. So you spend your time on that. Well, it's the same with this human existence. Why are we here? We're here to work on our minds, to develop our qualities, to actually, remove our negative tendencies. So this is what our practice is. The whole of our practice can be summarized in really those two things: to accumulate what is positive and to reduce what is negative. So let's carry on within the next three, which we can talk about together. It's important at the beginning, middle, and end of our practice. So it's very important initially when we come to the Dharma and get involved in the Dharma to recall the reality of death, because it gets us kind of the spark going. It gets everything moving in the right direction. That's why, again, it's set out at the very beginning of the Lam Rim. Again, most of you recall with the Lam Rim, we have three different levels, right? We have the person of the least capacity that we share teachings and meditations with, and then we have the person of middling capacity that we share teachings and meditation with, and then we have the level of great capacity, the great capable person that we are ideally striving to become, to be intent upon achieving Buddhahood. Well, within the very first of these sets of teachings is where we recognize the reality of death and impermanence. Prior to that, of course, in the preliminaries, we've understood that we have this perfect opportunity of this human life, and that moreover, we've met with the teachings through the kindness of our gurus. So we have to remind ourselves that this life isn't going to last forever. So at the very beginning of our practice, it's really important that we recall death and impermanence, because it's going to infuse the power and strength that we put into the rest of the path. Even in the middle of our path, even when we've been studying for a while and engaging in the teachings, more wholeheartedly, we need to still keep that mindfulness going. Why? Because otherwise we'll become distracted and we'll think, well, I still have plenty of time. I don't really need to be as focused on my Dharma practice. Because I do see some people that come in with great enthusiasm when they meet the Dharma, right? I even have had instances at the center here in Santa Fe when I was teaching, where people would come in and they'd be like so enthusiastic and buying all these books, and then they might come back for 1 week, but then you never see them again. They kind of disappear. And you go, well, what was that all about? You get this kind of burst of energy at the beginning. Well, in the middle, you need to sustain that. So the middle of our practice means that we have to constantly be mindful that we haven't escaped death yet. Death is a reality. Even when it comes to the end of our practice, which I'm betting most of us aren't at yet, where we actually have culminated our practice and are close to achieving these more final goals, we still need that impetus. We still need to recall death. It's always there, always present, and therefore always a very valuable tool to get us to put the energy into our practice. The sixth one is the exact opposite of the sixth one on the previous set of slides, right? You will die happily and peacefully with no regrets. They often say that at least the person who has some familiarity with death and impermanence will die without fear. I mean, what a wonderful thing there. I mean, many people, again, are very afraid when they approach death if they have no context for understanding what that is all about and haven't maybe used their life in a meaningful way. Well, if we have, well, then we will at least die without any fear. But they actually say that the person who's the greatest practitioner will be happy to experience death, kind of, joyful at death finally coming. But this does get into some deeper teachings where it said that if you do have kind of a good strength of practice with regard to some topics, particularly around wisdom of emptiness, those sorts of realizations, as well as some of the tantric realizations, then death is a very powerful portal. It's a wonderful opportunity for you to deepen your practice and to actually gain some spiritual realizations. So death for those beings, those yogis and yoginis who have really deeply practiced throughout this life, it's actually something they look forward to, because you can achieve great things in the process of death. Again, today we're not going to talk maybe quite so much about the actual death process, because that's an entire topic in and of itself. But in Tibetan Buddhism, the death process is taught as a way of understanding what will actually happen at death, so that we lessen so much of our fear, so that we understand what's going to happen in terms of the dissolution of various elements, and then eventually a subtler passage of the mind, all the way to what's called the mind of clear light. The mind of clear light is said to be the most powerful basis upon which to achieve great spiritual realizations. So when you hear those sorts of teachings as well, you can become very excited and go, wow, I really want to know what that's about. I really want to experience that. Death becomes something you're quite curious about and even happy to finally meet, finally, come into contact with. So this is the idea behind these more traditional ways of looking at the advantages, disadvantages of doing these sorts of contemplations. So you might wonder, well, then how do I go about kind of doing contemplations that are infused by those thoughts, that really want to achieve the benefit, want to have that in my life? Today, what I'm going to share with you are actually two different ways of looking at death awareness. And one of them comes from this wonderful book. Let me hold it up here for you. It's called Living in the Light of Death. And it's by Larry Rosenberg, who is a teacher with Insight Meditation Society, uh, which is more of the Vipassana tradition, kind of along the Theravadan lines. But there's a really wonderful contemplation or way that he goes about talking about the contemplation. And actually in this book, he also talks about the other one we're going to go into, which is more traditional in terms of the Tibetan approach, comes from Lama Atisha when he set out the Lam Rim teachings initially around how do we contemplate the reality of death, how do we do the death awareness meditation. So the very first one is what's called the 5 contemplations. So let me share those with you and talk about them. We've touched on some of them a little bit already, but he says the Buddha left us 5 contemplations, which he advised us to reflect on frequently. The first one, I am subject to aging. Aging is unavoidable. I am subject to illness. Illness is unavoidable. Third, I am subject to death. Death is unavoidable. These are, pretty much telling it like it is again, right? Just saying, this is the reality. We are embodied beings, and we have to deal with these 3 factors. And recall, this parallels what the Buddha saw as Prince Siddhartha when he went out to the towns and whatever and was seeing the reality of existence, not the candy-coated, sugar-coated palace view of everything being wonderful and delightful, but the reality that we all have to face at least those 3 things. Of course, when the Buddha taught on this, he also included birth. But most of us, of course, we've been born already. We don't think about birth. Once you're born, aging begins. Of course, aging is primarily highlighting old age because we see again that the deterioration of the body that occurs as people age is the most distressing for people, the hardest for people, right? Losing vitality, losing energy. Then, of course, illness. No one gets out of a single life without any illness, I'm sure. We all have some degree of illness. Some people have more chronic illnesses. Some people have just occasional illnesses. Some people end up with terminal illnesses that they have to deal with, over periods of time until they die. Illness is a reality of having this embodied form as well. It's subject to illness. And then, of course, the third one, subject to death. Yeah. Again, this is the main topic that we're talking about today, but as I said, it's death and loss. It's the loss of all the things that we have that we do eventually have to let go of. And of course, this life is the big one when we actually have to say farewell to this existence. So these 3 points in and of themselves, it's like a whole meditation. You can just sit there and repeat it like a mantra to yourself. I am subject to aging. Aging is unavoidable. I am subject to aging. Aging is unavoidable. In our culture, of course, we do so much to stop the visible effects of aging, but you're not stopping aging. Aging is going to continue in your body in spite of whatever you do, to try to keep yourself from looking older. And, these things are fine for people to engage in, but don't let that mask the reality. Those are the first 3 that, again, are very sobering. Number 4 is, I will grow different, separate from all that is dear and appealing to me. This kind of encapsulates all of them to some degree, that things will change, things will be different from where they are now. I will eventually have to separate from all that is dear and appealing to me. Of course, that can also become a doorway through which we once more can take a look at how preoccupied we are with the affairs of this life, the things that we surround ourselves with, all of the material possessions, as well as the comfort, everything, all of that you're going to have to give up. You can't take a single thing with you. They often say that the consciousness sort of leaves this life just like hair and butter. I know it's kind of a weird analogy, but like if you had a hair that was somehow stuck in some butter, if you pull the hair out, nothing comes with it, right? Just the consciousness leaves. That's it. We don't take any of this stuff with us. You can't take it with you when you go, like they say. So the reality is that we will become different. Things will change. We will eventually have to separate from all of this. Again, whether we're talking about our youth, whether we're talking about our good health, whether we're talking about just this life, talking about all the material possessions we have, our own body, what have you, all of these things are subject to that 4th idea. Excuse me, everything that we find dear and that is appealing, we will have to separate from. Excuse me, just one moment to take a drink of water. Number five is an interesting one because it's really not about the subject of death so much, but it's about what happens after death. I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, and live dependent on my actions. Whatever I do, for good or for ill, to that will I fall heir. The Buddha in the Dhammapada has a very similar idea of kind of like, that happiness follows us like our shadow follows our body if we have engaged in good actions. Suffering follows us just like the cart follows the ox in the same way, again, if we have engaged in negative actions. The law of karma is the whole guiding principle underneath all of this. And that's why death becomes very important, is because it's at death when the sort of fruition of all of our actions of this life really comes to the forefront. Because what dictates to a large degree where you go from here are the actions you did with this life. Obviously, the actions you've done with other lives are there as well, but it's really important to spend this life engaging in some consciousness, some awareness of what we're doing, the actions we're engaging in through our thoughts, through our words, through our deeds. So that's where the importance of death comes into play as well, is that it's at death when a karmic seed will ripen that will propel us into our next existence. And even the state of mind that we have at that time is important to be attentive to, because that will have some bearing on which karmic seeds come forward, what sorts of things inform our next existence, that first of all project us into that life, so that that determines whether you're born as a human or an animal or a particular type of animal, what have you. But then we also have kind of the completing karma, that's not just projecting us into a life, but giving us all the details of that life. What type of a life do we have? If we end up being a human again, well, that's great. But what if we're a human born in, like, in horrible things that are happening in Somalia right now with the drought and famine, prices of food being so exorbitant due to the war and all of this? If we were born in such a place where we couldn't even, all the energy we put into our lives is simply to get food for ourselves and our family to eat. And then what sort of life would we have to practice the Dharma? So that fifth point is really highlighting the necessity of using this life meaningfully, of actually engaging in positive actions, Dharma practice. As I said, the essence of our Dharma practice is tending to creating more positive states of mind and diminishing the negative ones. And that's really what we have to be constantly aware of, constantly doing. That will have great effect on what we do, from here, the life that we have after this existence. Okay, so I want to share a little bit more of what Larry Rosenberg says. I really like that book, by the way. It's a wonderful book. He has a very clever way of talking about some of these things. He says, this isn't the cheeriest set of reflections in the world, right? Those five I just shared with you, you may not even want to share them with anyone else because you're afraid you'll bum them out or something. Most people, when they first hear them, feel some resistance. They don't mind contemplating the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence in the world around them, but this is getting a little close to home. We might not have a difficulty going, oh, well, yeah, this is impermanent, that is impermanent. But when it comes to I am impermanent and everything happening around my existence is impermanent, my health is impermanent, my youth is impermanent, my very life is impermanent. Yeah, so what is being asked of us, he says, as meditators, is to come face to face with the law of impermanence in a very intimate way. Right? This is for us to have that. Venerable Rubina often uses this. I think this is a British phrase, when the other penny drops or something. I don't know. She uses a phrase like that. We have to sort of get it. Something has to register. Again, maybe some of you who came to the Dharma from an experience of death or having lost someone, and you were looking for meaning and purpose in life, maybe the penny had already dropped. It had already been kind of, I get it. I really understand that this is compelling me to do something, to search for meaning, to do whatever is necessary. But, for some of us, might have come to the Dharma out of just curiosity and what have you, and we didn't really get that message. We didn't have everything kind of fall apart in our lives. We didn't have a serious illness to face or the loss of someone, what have you. So again, we each have to examine this. And even those who might have come with an initial motivation, you might need, again, the strength of that in the middle. You might need to keep reinforcing that, because we tend to forget. We look at things in a very narrow focus in terms of our own experience at the moment. So eventually we have to get this to register some very deep states of mind. Now, these are a couple of terms. I'm going to share with you a couple of terms that are presented in the Pali tradition that Larry Rosenberg speaks about. The first one is what's called Sambega, towards the top of the screen there. It says in Pali, this phenomenon is known as Sambega, the urgent need to practice that can grow out of heightened sense of the perishable nature of life. It can include a real feeling of shock and a sense not only that life doesn't last forever, but also that the way we have been living is wrong. So we don't use this term Sambega in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but I really like sharing it because I think it is a part of the process. For many of us, again, we might approach these teachings initially and we might think, well, yeah, I need to kind of do something. We gain a sense of urgency around this life, but we don't think about the process that's involved in this. And there are two elements to it. The first is this Sambega mind. Sambega is once more thinking, wow, I really need to step up the game here. I need to do something different. This isn't something I can be blind to. The reality of death is definitely in my face, and I accept it. I understand it, and therefore I have to do something with this life. He continues, he says here, it might turn our world upside down, sending us off to a whole new way of life. Even if it doesn't have so dramatic an effect, it can light a fire under our practice. We get much less caught up in power, prestige, money, lust, the acquisition of goods. Again, these are all things we could include within those 8 worldly dharmas. They're not mentioned maybe quite as specifically, but this is our preoccupation with all the pleasures of this life. And I love this phrase, even if it doesn't have so dramatic an effect, it can light a fire under our practice. I think I've mentioned that earlier. This is what Sambega does. Sambega is this very powerful force that moves us in that direction. But then there's a second element to it, Pasada. An important accompaniment to Sambega is the Pali concept of Pasada, which might be translated as clear and serene confidence, a conviction that our situation isn't hopeless, that the practice of meditation can take us beyond sickness, aging, and death, right? So he says the problems, let me finish this part and then I'll talk about the two of them together. The problem surrounding these phenomena is not external to us. It has everything to do with our cravings and attachment. Suffering is not a dead end, but a gateway to realization. The proper application of the practice, and what in the Pali tradition, it's what's called the Eightfold Path. In our tradition, it would be what's called the 3 higher trainings, and of course the Bodhisattva trainings and accompaniment to that. That can turn the pain of sickness and death into the joy of liberation. So again, these two terms are kind of interesting. Samvega kind of gets you off your complacent couch, decides you got to do something and you need to start changing things because it's not helpful to continue going in that direction in the way that we have. And then secondly, we need some confidence that there is a way out of all of this, that there is something that will actually be effective in removing these fears, and actually confronting these fears and dealing with them once and for all. Of course, again, in the Buddhist traditions of the Theravada and what have you, the emphasis tends to be on one's own liberation. In the Mahayana tradition, it tends to be on attaining Buddhahood that goes beyond one's own liberation to achieve that state where we can benefit others to a greater degree. But regardless, we do have to have both elements in place. We have to have the impetus to change and do something different. But secondly, the confidence that there's a way to actually accomplish that. As I said, in the Mahayana tradition, especially in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that we study, the Lam Rim is what we develop some greater confidence in, that all the teachings of the Lam Rim spell out for us exactly how we can become enlightened. This confidence instills in us, of course, a deeper sense of refuge, a deeper sense of reliance upon the teachings of the Buddha, which then we practice more and more because we have greater confidence that it's actually going to get us where we want to be. Yeah. In our worldly lives, we often have, confidence in various things that we think will get us to where we want to be professionally. Even, for example, if someone wants to become an artist of some sort, well, then they look up the various resources that will help them to get into that art, to understand how to make pots or how to, do watercolor painting or whatever the case might be. And they research the teachers that can help them on that path, and they have great confidence that there's a way to actually accomplish that mundane goal. Whether it be in the vein of an artist or a oncologist or whatever the case might be, whatever your career is, you gain some confidence that there's an actual ability to accomplish that. Well, it's the Buddhist path is no different. We actually have to have that same sort of confidence and commitment to understanding the way to actually accomplish the goals that the Buddha set out. The temporal goal of gaining a good rebirth that we start with, and then again, the more ultimate goals. So these are kind of interesting concepts, and I really, again, wanted to share them with you because even though we don't kind of highlight them in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, I think they're both part of the process of turning away from where we have been and moving towards where we want to be. Excuse me again. In our tradition, though, we tend to use what's called the 9-point death awareness meditation, which is really, again, an expansion upon that one line, right, of I am subject to death, death is unavoidable. And it sort of takes that thread and really drives it home through these 9 points that are covered under 3 root propositions. Now, the introduction to this, and usually they talk about this at the beginning of the Lam Rim topic of death and impermanence. This comes from the Mahayana Mahaparinirvana Sutra. Of all footprints, the elephant's footprint is supreme, right? It's the largest on the earth. We don't have a larger being. Well, now we don't. There were dinosaurs, I'm sure, that had larger footprints, but of all of the beings, that leave footprints on the earth, the elephant's is the supreme. Of all perceptions, remembering death and impermanence is supreme. Again, just re-emphasizing that idea that this has the most profound impact on our mind, just like the footprint in the soil. Death and impermanence will do that for us. So as I said, there are 3 root propositions. Let me introduce this a little before we go into this, because I think it is important to spend at least a little time talking about this, because this is the way that we actually maintain that mindfulness of death in our tradition, that we become enthused about this topic even by looking at it and going, I need to get my head around this and really feel that force behind my practice. Again, that Sambega sort of concept. And then, of course, the Pasada that comes along with it, that is our understanding that there is a way out, that we actually can accomplish the goal of Buddhahood. So the 3 root propositions are essentially the first one, death is certain. Well, death is certain. As I said earlier, you can ask anyone on the street, are you going to die? They'll probably say yes, unless they've got some really strange ideas that, every one of us has accepted some level of our mortality. But do we live our lives with that awareness? Because again, that's what we're talking about today, an acceptance that goes beyond just, oh yeah, I'm going to die, but actually makes it integral to how we live every day of our lives. The second one is the one that Lama Tsongkhapa actually emphasizes as the most important, which is that the time of death is uncertain. This is something that we really have to get, because otherwise we might have this delusion thinking that death is going to come way out there in the future and not recognizing that it could be right around the corner. We don't know. Okay. The third one is really to look at what is important at the time of death and to come to the conclusion that really what's important, because that hair coming out of butter is like the consciousness again leaving. What's important is what we do with our consciousness, what we do with kind of the imprints on our consciousness through our actions, how we've transformed our awareness, and everything else falls to the wayside. Doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to it at all, but it's not as important as what we do with our spiritual practice. So those are the 3 main contemplations, the 3 root propositions. And Lama Atisha, when he brought these teachings into Tibet, really emphasized 3 individual contemplations within each of those. That's how we get our 9-point death awareness meditation. So what I'd like to do now then, whoops, I went through to the second one, somehow I did that. Is go through each of these, each root proposition, talk about the reasons that are contemplated within them, and then look at the resolution that we come to on the basis of this contemplation. Again, and you can find these teachings in any of the Lam Rim texts, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, Lam Rim text by His Holiness, and so on. Number 1, death will definitely come. Nothing can prevent it. Of course, again, most people understand that in an intellectual way, but what they encourage you to do at this first point is to actually go back and think about all the figures from the past, right? Maybe think about when you studied history, world history, American history. Did you study any being who lived, who was a general or a president or a prime minister or a spiritual leader or whatever who escaped death? Were there any of them who escaped death? Then think about beings you've known in this life who have succumbed to death already. Every one of us, I'm sure, has had relatives of some sort, if not friends, other people in our lives who we have seen, go to uh, the other side, who have died. So we can think about the reality of death for all of them. Then we can think about even those people we currently have in our lives who are still so full of life, how they too are going to have to die. It is inevitable for them. Nothing can prevent their death, and then eventually have it come home to you. So you start off kind of like in the big circle of like people who are from the past, and then you think about people who are alive today, and then you bring it home to, you know, uh, your own sort of dear friends and what have you, and your own self eventually. And you want to get to this place where it finally hits home. Yes, my death is not preventable. I will have to die. I will have to face that reality. For the second point, lifespan cannot be increased and it decreases continuously. They encourage you to do different sort of visualizations even around this. The one that's I hear many teachers refer to as like a train that is on its destination. Say it's going from New York City to San Francisco or something. I don't know if there even is a train route that runs that, but it's continually moving, continually going, and it gets closer and closer to its destination. Never goes backwards, always continues to go forward, and eventually arrives. The one I like to use is an hourglass. Maybe think of like that big hourglass in The Wizard of Oz, right? Where the witch sets it there and Dorothy has to watch all the little grains go through. I mean, we have to think of a pretty big hourglass though, because we're thinking about our life, right? Our life starts with who knows how many grains of sand in the upper chamber. And of course, as soon as our life starts, the grains of sand begin to descend down, and they're going continually. We can't like put our finger up in there and plug it up for a while and say, I'm going to take a break from this whole process. I'm not going to get closer to death for the next week or two. It's always happening. The grains of sand are continually falling. Now, in the next set of meditations, we're going to get into the questioning of how many grains of sand are in the upper chamber, right? Because that's the uncertainty of the time of our death. We don't know when the last grains of sand are going to come through. Here, the point is to think about the reality that they're continually coming through. And you're never taking grains of sand from the bottom and shoving them back in the top, right? You're never going backwards. It's always happening. You're always 1 second closer to death. You can even do a meditation on the breath, though, right? We don't know how many breaths we have left in this life, but every inhalation and exhalation, that's one breath closer to death. Inhalation, exhalation, another breath closer to death. It's a very powerful meditation to do. You can also think about your heart beating, right? We don't know how many more beats of our heart we have, but every heartbeat is another heartbeat closer to death. Again, whatever it takes, this whole second point is really to have it drive home that you are on this ride to a destination that is death, that you're not going to be able to stop, that is going to continually move forward, and you can't go back to the beginning. A lot of people think about, oh, if I could go back to when I was 16 or 15 or whatever. Well, that doesn't happen, right? Continually moves forward. The third one isn't really a reason for why death is certain, but it recognizes that death will certainly come regardless of whether you've made time to practice Dharma or not. There are many people who spend their time, engaging in a lot of stuff, once more thinking that death is some time way out in the future. Death is still going to come, whether you've taken advantage of this life and actually engaged in dedicated practice. Here, they encourage you also to do the meditation on kind of reflecting on a single day of your life, an average day of your life. How much of your day is actually Dharma practice? Now, again, by Dharma practice, we can be certainly referring to something more formal. Your time sitting on a meditation cushion, your time doing Dharma study and practice, your time doing various recitations and other practices, what have you. That's more formal Dharma practice. We can say that we can engage in round the clock Dharma practice if we have the strength of mind, which is paying attention to our minds, changing our thoughts, being in touch with the Dharma as we go about our daily business. But of course, for most of us, we might not have the strength of power there. So our Dharma practice might be those little pockets, those windows of time that we have, that we actually engage in Dharma practice. In fact, in the last set of teachings I'm going to do for you this month, I want to talk about practicing Buddhism minute by minute. So how we can gain a force to our practice so that we can be like that. So every moment of our day becomes powerful. But for most of us, again, we're not there yet. So we look at an average day. How much of your day is dedicated practice time compared to how much of your day is sleeping to begin with? That's probably the largest chunk of our day, right? Most of us sleeping, I don't know, 7 to 9 hours, maybe a little less for some, maybe a little more for others, I don't know. Then we have a good chunk of our day, those of you who are still working, where you're engaged in work at your workplace or in home doing work, whatever it is that you do for work. Then we have a part of our day spent in perhaps buying, preparing, eating food. We spend a lot of time around our food, right? Um, then we have, a part of our day where we spend on the computer, maybe doing various things, doing this, doing that. We might even spend a lot of time texting, phoning, being with friends. Maybe if those of you who have children know you spend a fair amount of time tending to your children, sitting with them, helping them with, their homework or whatever it is. You kind of pick your whole day apart and you recognize that maybe, unless I really have a strong mind throughout all of those things, maybe I'm not practicing the Dharma fully. Maybe I need to be a little more dedicated and persistent in my practice by recognizing that death's going to come whether I practiced or not. And the most important thing, as we're going to see when we get to the final point of these, is that what I've done with my life, how I've dedicated my life to spiritual practice, is the big defining factor as to whether I've used this life well. So these first three are very powerful just to get us in the ballpark, to get us to really understand the reality of death and that death will come regardless of how we've spent our day. The first resolution is then, since death is definite, I must practice Dharma. I have to engage in some form of a spiritual practice because otherwise, again, death will come and I won't be ready for that. Okay. Number two, the time of death is uncertain. As I said, Lama Tsongkhapa says, this is the big one. This is the one we have to really spend a fair amount of time looking at. The fourth point of the 9 points, again, the three that relate to this proposition. The lifespan of beings in this world isn't certain. Now, in Buddhist cosmology, they do actually say there are some realms of humans where there is a set lifespan. I think in one it's like 500 years, and another it's like 1,000 years. I don't know. I mean, if you thought about having 500 years, we'd probably still waste like most of them. We just, do more things with 500 years, see more things, what have you. But in this world, regardless of what there might be in other worlds, in this world we see there's no set lifespan. Even an exercise that can kind of get you into understanding this is to recognize that, go to the obituaries and you can see often, if it's a fairly large, listing of obituaries, the variance in ages. You might have some people who are quite young, maybe even teenagers or children who have died if they're posting an obituary for. And then you have people who are in their younger adult years, middle-age years, older years, senior years. You have the whole gamut. Yes, the preponderance of them might be in the upper brackets, but they're from all different ages, right? There's no guarantee that you won't die at any particular age. Beings die in the womb. Beings die shortly after being born. Beings die when they are infants. Beings die when they are children, and so on. There's no set age at which death won't come for you. The second of these is to recognize the various causes. There are more factors that are conducive to death than life. And this isn't to make you paranoid and think, well, I can't do anything because there are all these various factors out there that might cause my death rather than increase my life or support my life. But the reality is there's at least three different categories of things that we can examine that give us some insight into how death, it's not that it's right around the corner all the time, but there are various things that could happen. And they do happen in our world. Again, if we pay attention and listen to various ways that people die, we see that people die oftentimes doing some of the most mundane things. Actually, like that show 6 Feet Under that was on HBO some years back, because every episode would start with somebody dying. And sometimes it was quite, catastrophic. Sometimes it was like an older Asian man that was pushing his garbage out to the sidewalk and he just keeled over. And there was a woman who died, she didn't have a glass of water and she was choking on a sandwich or something. All these various things that can happen. The three categories are essentially, you can be dealing with death from something that is external, an external factor, right? It can be, hurricanes. It can be the various other harm from the elements. It can be an accident, automobile accident, plane accident, what have you. You have a lot of external factors involved in the death of beings. Secondly, you can have internal factors, right? Things that happen from within, organs malfunctioning, things that occur in the body, the cancers that happen due to the diet we eat and what have you, and so on. The third thing is, even though some of those things that we eat to sustain our lives can sometimes be the cause of our death. Remember a few years back, there was an E. coli scare around organic spinach or lettuce or something. I don't remember what it was, but it was one of these, greens that people were eating, and you think, oh, I'm eating organic food. I mean, I'm safe. I have this wonderful food I'm nourishing my body with. Well, it can be infected with E. coli. And we don't know some of the things that we take to sustain our lives, medicines even, might be the cause of our death. So again, this isn't to make you sort of freaked out to where you think, oh my God, I've got external things, internal things, and even things I take to support my life are going to possibly cause my death. I can't do anything. You become paralyzed. Just to recognize that actually it takes a lot to sustain this life. It takes a lot to keep everything going. And the factors around us are there for us to potentially lose this life. That reinforces once more the idea that it's uncertain when death will occur. I often theorize. Of course, we wouldn't know because how would you know? But I theorize that something like 99.9% of the people who die in any particular day didn't think that was the day they were going to die. And even if it was somebody who was in a hospice situation, who was kind of on their last moments of life, supposedly, they still might have that resistance thinking, well, but it's not going to happen today. I know I'm dying, but it's not going to happen today. Well, why not? So this, again, this second point of these three and pertaining to the time of death being uncertain is really to show us that there are a variety of things out there that can be the cause of our death. The third one that's here, number 6 of the 9 points, is our bodies are very fragile. I think we saw this with regard to COVID, right? Here we have this tiny little thing. I mean, they have the little blown up pictures of it with all its little spikes and what have you, this COVID virus. But it's very, very tiny, right? It's being shared through the aerosols that we produce when we breathe and what have you, and cough and sneeze. I mean, it's very, very slight. It's a very, very small thing that can enter into our bodies. We inhale it and suddenly it's a part of our bodies and causing infection, and with many people causing their death. I mean, it shows that these bodies are really quite fragile. We like to think that because we exercise and we do all these various things, and remember that happened too during the pandemic. There were a lot of people who were in really, really good health, right? They said, I can't believe this happened to this man, this woman, what have you. They were in such perfect health. They exercised all the time. They did all these various things, ate all this really good food, but they still were subject to death. We still don't know when that agent's going to be there that's going to cause something to happen to us, perhaps. Again, because this body is fragile. The blood clots, for example. I think there was even a commercial on TV that said, about life being ended by something so small, just a tiny little blood clot that can happen, and we might have a stroke, and then that might be the end of our life. So again, I'm not trying to freak people out by these meditations. This is to wake us up to the reality that we are walking around. Sometimes they use the idea of we're sort of corpses walking around. We're waiting for that death to happen, but we're walking around with a corpse. It's a future corpse at this point, but that is our reality. This human body will become a corpse, and it's absolutely uncertain when. Now, in regard to these contemplations, I'm going to go back to the resolution that we have from this. Let's actually do that, and then I'll talk about what Rinpoche often says. The resolution that we have from this second set of contemplations is the time of my death is uncertain. Therefore, I must practice Dharma now. Right? It's not just that we have to practice Dharma that we got from the first set of 3 points. It's that we have to practice it now because there's no guarantee of tomorrow. Lama Zopa Rinpoche often encourages us to wake up with the thought of first rejoicing that we haven't died overnight, because many beings do die in their sleep, right? So we can go, oh my gosh, I've got another day of this existence, but not let us fall under the sway of, oh, but it's not going to happen today. Instead, he encourages us to think, and I will die today. I'm going to live my life as if I will die today. And we're not making an affirmation. Remember these daily affirmations that were so popular? You're not saying, I will die today, and it's actually going to happen. It's the idea that if you think that throughout your day, that this is your last day, you're going to make very different choices, aren't you? You're going to decide how to use this life on the basis of accepting the reality that this could be your last day. But I would encourage you, even if you wake up and you think, this could be my last day, that's already a doorway to get you in that ballpark. You don't have to maybe go so far as to think I will die today, but that becomes even stronger. Then you think, okay, what if today was your last day? What if you knew that today was your last day and you lived your life accordingly? It'd be very different, right? I think we would live our lives very differently. And one day we're going to be right, folks. We've been wrong so far. If we've had that thought, oh, I'm going to die today. Oh, we didn't die today. Okay, how wonderful. I'm going to think I'm going to die today, the next day, and then so on. But of course, we've been right so far in thinking I'm not going to die today with our deluded mind, but one day we are going to be wrong in that regard, and we're going to be right in thinking that we are going to die that day. So however you work with it, try to at least get out of this mindset that is blind to the reality that death could happen that day, that there's no certainty to having even this particular day. Now, to enter into the last set, I want to share a little bit of what Larry Rosenberg, because as I said, he does work with these 9 contemplations and 9-point death awareness in his book as well, besides the 5 contemplations. He says this last set of contemplations is an extremely rich one for Dharma practitioners. It is in some ways a minute examination of the 4th contemplation from our earlier group. I will grow different, separate from all that is dear and appealing to me. Remember that one? It can be an extremely effective, if difficult, set of exercises, right? Because we have to think about letting go of all of that we have, that huge loss that occurs at the time of death. What I would encourage you to do, he says, is actually picture yourself on your deathbed. And I often give this same advice. Settle into a period of meditation. Establish some samadhi, some meditative stabilization. Then do a visualization. Imagine yourself in your room with a clear mind, waiting for the moment of death. Imagine what you might be thinking and feeling. So I inserted this in here. I got exposed to this book through doing some hospice work. One of the patients that I was working with had this book called The Japanese Death Poems. They're quite interesting. Apparently there's a tradition in Japan of writing your death poem shortly before you die. And this one was, "Oh, young folk, if you fear death, die now. Having died once, you won't die again." Kind of the idea being that if we really do this meditation and think about our death and the reality of it happening, then we don't really die again because we've already examined it. We've already kind of seen what the effect is going to be on our minds by thinking about all the loss that will occur, everything we're going to have to let go of. So anyway, I don't know if that poem by that person who passed away, whether that really is at the heart of it. But as I said earlier, the third root proposition is at the time of death, nothing but the Dharma can benefit. Nothing but our spiritual practice is important. Now, how the examination is done is once more, you think you're on your deathbed and you think about these 3 things that are in the reasons. First of all, your friends, and imagine them being there around the bedside with you. Your wealth and possessions, all the things that you have in your room, in your house, wherever that you live. And then third, your own body, which is absolutely there because it's you dying in your body, right? Your body ceasing to be a source for sustaining this life. You think about each of these, how your friends won't be of any benefit. I mean, sure, it's nice to have some friends, and maybe even Dharma friends around at the time of death. Our director here, the former director of our center, Rowena Mayer, passed away in January. And it was wonderful that she had friends and other Dharma people supporting her at the time of death. And it helps to have that, certainly. But when you go into death and have the death process actually occurring, you have to leave all your friends behind. You can't take your friends with you. You can't say, "Oh, would you mind coming with me? I'm kind of frightened and not sure what's going to happen here." You're going to have to leave them behind. They're not going to be of much use to you then. Again, might be helpful in caring for your body as you approach death. Secondly, resources and enjoyments, wealth, all the things that you have also might make you a little more comfortable at the time of death. You can afford good care. You can afford to be in a nice place and stay at home, through hospice and what have you. All these things, yeah, nice to have, but you're going to have to leave all of that behind. All the wonderful possessions that you have, all the things that you enjoy, every single one of them is gone at the time of death because it's no longer in your life. We'll have to let that go. Again, a great sense of loss around that as well. But one of the deepest forms of losses that we have is around losing this body. Why? Because our consciousness has been with this body from day one. From conception, of course, which we don't remember, and all the time that the consciousness was together with our body in the womb. And then when we were born, and we often don't even remember our early years, but we certainly have a strong identification of the body being us and who we are and being a part of us. And we're going to have to let this body go too. For many people with death, of course, the body's quite ravaged by illness, and so it may not be, something we really hold on to dearly. But nonetheless, we still have some attachment to this body. We still have attachment to this life. They even say that when you go into the death process and you're leaving behind this body, the craving to be embodied again plays a key role in ripening the karma for your next existence. So this body is going to have to be left behind as well. So when you think about this, being on your deathbed and really contemplating each of these three things and coming to the conclusion that, yes, you're going to be losing them, and moreover, they really cannot benefit. The way you've relied upon them in the past is not going to be capable at the time of death. I think there's one great master, Tibetan master, who says, your body supports you, protects you, helps you all through this life, but at the time when you need it the most, it deserts you. All these things desert you. You cannot take them with you. You cannot rely upon them. They're going to be potentially even something that drags you back and holds you back, because if you have great attachment to all these things, it's going to be very hard to leave this life. The third resolution then is, as nothing but Dharma will benefit me at the time of death, I must practice Dharma purely. And of course, this drives home the point that what is going with you, again, if we say I'm going to let go of all of my friends, all of my resources, even this body, all this stuff in this world disappears, it's gone. Well, what does go forward? Simply our minds and all the imprints on our minds due to what we have done with this life and the extent to which we've engaged in spiritual practice, which I'll highlight once more, means diminishing our negative tendencies and reducing all of that and accentuating and developing all of our positive traits, all of our qualities. So again, this is the work we have to do. In the end, the final conclusion is, not only do I have to practice Dharma, I have to practice it purely, and I have to put great energy into practicing it so that I can rest assured that when this life ends, I've got a safe passage into my next existence, at least, with the assurance that what I've done in this life will pay off in terms of having a good life with good conditions, so I can continue my spiritual development. And in fact, for most of us, even though we like to hold the ideal, particularly in the tantric teachings, that we're going to become enlightened in this very life, and it's good to have that thought, for most of us, we probably will need a continuity of good rebirths. So that's why the emphasis on death is also there, because if you don't tend to this life through remembering death and so on, in the way we're talking about today, then we may not get another good rebirth in our next life. And it becomes a bit of a slippery slope. We end up in one unfortunate rebirth, and we might end up having many, many more lower rebirths follow from that. Why? Because we can end up in a life where we don't create much virtue. Even animals don't create much virtue unless they're coerced by humans often. Some mammals in particular might care for other beings or what have you. We often see those, right? Those animal friends, the weird ones, like the mother tiger that let the little baby pigs nurse on her or something, you know. But most animals don't naturally go to situations where they engage in virtue. They just live their lives with one thought: I want to stay alive through being protected, getting food, whatever is involved. So again, once you end up in an unfortunate rebirth, then things begin to move down from there. Often it's very hard to get back into a good existence. That's this next contemplation in the Lam-Rim recall. And after we look at death and impermanence, then we look at the lower realms and the reality that we could end up there. That gives us further impetus to take refuge in the three jewels, and then of course to have some commitment to karma and to following the law of karma. But it all begins with death awareness. And as I said with this last point, to really recognize that we have to practice with pure intention, great strength. Don't practice for the welfare of this life, practice for future existences at least, if not for liberation and for enlightenment. So the last thing I want to share with you today, and I'm going to go through this rather briefly, just maybe if you're curious about this, I thought I would share maybe something that comes from a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, but is perhaps a little more secular. Most of what we've dealt with today is around Buddhism and kind of the importance of remembering death. But this is what are called the four tasks of living and dying that are set out by Christine Longacre. She was a student of Sogyal Rinpoche's, and she was a hospice worker. I think she still is out in Santa Cruz, California. And she wrote a book called Facing Death and Finding Hope that's really quite nice. And although there is a lot of Tibetan Buddhist stuff in it, it also tries to approach things from a more broader stroke of different spiritual traditions, and again, even a bit secular. She defines four tasks that are important, for us to kind of do on the basis of this, that have to be done at death, if possible, if we haven't done them through life. So I want to talk about them mostly in terms of life, but the first one is understanding and responding to suffering, to recognize that, as we've seen in those meditations, in those contemplations, suffering is a reality. Folks, you're gonna, if you live long enough, you're gonna deal with old age. If you're gonna inevitably deal with illness. If you haven't dealt with illness before, you're also going to, eventually die. You're gonna have to be separated from everything that is dear. You're gonna have all of that suffering in your life. That is a reality. Every one of us has suffering. This was the first truth that the Buddha taught, right? The truth of dukkha, of dissatisfaction, suffering. So we have to have a healthier response to this, right? We have to actually embrace that reality and use it as an impetus to engage in the other tasks as well, to engage in the things that will make this life more meaningful and purposeful. But recognizing and waking up to the reality of suffering is a key part of all of this. The second one, in terms of the second task that she sets out, is making a connection, healing relationships, and letting go. Now, obviously, at the time of death, this becomes very important. Why? Because if you go into the death process with distorted relationships with friends or relatives, where you have a lot of animosity, resentment, things you're holding on to that haven't been forgiven, and you can't let go of all of that, it's going to be hard. If we live our lives, though, where we're constantly concerned about making sure that we tend to the relationships we have with others, as well as, of course, with the world around us, but to be as at peace with all of that, then when death comes, there won't be so much to let go of. There won't be so much to process. We're calling them once more that the time of death is absolutely uncertain. Are you ready to die today? Have you made the connections with people, established the things that need to be done? Have you actually, healed the relationships you have with others so you can die peacefully? If suddenly are faced with the reality of, I think I'm going to die right now. Well, what are the regrets that you have? What are the things that you feel that you haven't taken care of? Because I think some of that is important as well. I mean, obviously, from a Buddhist point of view, it's important that we've used this life for our spiritual practice and so on. But if we also have this unfinished business and stuff that we're carrying around with us, that becomes a very heavy burden at the time of death, then I think we're going to have problems. That's going to be our main preoccupation, is like, oh my gosh, I never apologized to that person. I never forgave them for what they did to me. Okay, that's the sort of stuff that's discussed in the second task. The third task is preparing spiritually for death, kind of recognizing that we have to be tending to our actions, as it was said earlier, and remembering that we are heir to our actions, that actually what we do in this life has an effect on our future existence. So we have to be attentive to that, purify our non-virtue as much as possible. Again, I won't go into the techniques for purification. They're taught in the Lam Rim very extensively in the section on karma, but there are techniques for kind of pulling those weeds out, making sure that they don't continue to grow. Purification is an important part of how we prepare spiritually for death. And of course, we also engage in what virtue we can. Coming up on Tuesday, 2 days from now, is a very powerful merit-making day. Of course, this whole first 2 weeks of this lunar month, the fourth lunar month of the Tibetan calendar, are said to be all very powerful, but it culminates with the full moon day on Tuesday, that's Sakadawa, that commemorates the birth of the Buddha, his enlightenment, and his parinirvana, his showing the aspect of dying and passing away, to give us that final teaching on impermanence. But essentially, that day becomes a very powerful day for practice. So take advantage of it, folks. Do what you can to practice virtue as strongly as you can, familiarizing yourself even with the death process. As I said, in Tibetan Buddhism, under the tantric teachings, they have teachings that show the various dissolutions of elements that occur. And then even after breathing stops, the subtler dissolutions that occur that spell out exactly what's going to occur. Well, that's also spiritually preparing for death. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is to become aware of what's going to happen. As I said, I won't have time to go into that today, but that's a very powerful way to make your mind, quite familiar, so that when death comes, you go, oh, I've been rehearsing for death all my life. I know what's supposed to be happening, and I'm here now and don't have any anxiety about that process. By the way, on that one, a really wonderful book to look at that is The Mind of Clear Light by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It was originally published with a different title, but anyway, I think it's called now The Mind of Clear Light. And anyway, that book goes into these 9-point death awareness meditations, as well as other advice around death, but goes into a lot of detail around what all transpires at the time of death. So again, if you haven't had teachings on that, that's also a wonderful source for you to be able to look at that. So there's a lot we can do to spiritually prepare for death, and we should be doing that once more every day as much as possible. The fourth task, which again, for most of us, hopefully we've already done this task to some degree by accepting our death, the reality of our death, trying to live our lives in a more meaningful way, to recognize that this life, transitory, but rich with opportunity. And this human existence, as I was pointing out with animals, sometimes my cats come in here when I'm teaching and what have you, but they're pretty much just like kind of laying there and half asleep and whatever. They might be getting some imprints from what I'm saying, but they're certainly not hearing what I'm saying and processing it. In this human existence, we have this amazing opportunity to make this life meaningful. So be sure to use the death awareness and the understanding of death to infuse your life with great meaning and purpose. When it comes down to it, in Mahayana terms, we have one purpose in life, which is to help all sentient beings by becoming a Buddha ourselves. And so that guides our every action, determines how we spend our time, determines what sorts of things we do and what we don't do. So again, finding meaning for people, it will be at different levels depending upon, again, in a more secular context, it might just mean somebody waking up to the reality of death, recognizing they have to value some things in their life more than others, value what they're doing with their relationships and what have you, rather than money and all these other transitory things. But for us as Mahayana Buddhists, real meaning and purpose is to devote our lives to work for the benefit of others. So I want to share a little bit from her book. This was the original. Whoops, sorry, I didn't put that on a slide. I've got to go to the book. This was the original version of the book when it was published back in whenever, and I'm guessing it was sometime around 2000. Let's see if I can find that. Anyway, she's, yeah, I'm not finding it on here. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Let me go to a little passage that she shares about kind of completing your work on these, completing the 4 tasks of living and dying. She says, this is page 156 of this book, the Finding Death and Facing Hope. Facing death and finding hope, sorry. Facing death is an especially profound opportunity to undertake the tasks of personal and spiritual growth. Yet we don't have to wait until the end of life to begin to face ourselves and grow. Imagining ourselves on our future deathbed when we contemplate our present choices, we can free ourselves from the regret and shame that we might experience. Each task contains the seed of all the others. Applying ourselves to beginning any one of them can bring us closer to the fundamental goodness of our nature. We will reap the rewards the next time suffering or grief comes into our life. And without a doubt, by having begun to heal our relationship with life and having prepared for our own death, we will know how to compassionately support others going through crisis or facing death. So again, I think that these 4 can be used by almost anybody. I feel like if you know people in your life who aren't Buddhists, you can share those 4 with them, and they might help them to kind of understand the reality of death, and that they can use an understanding of death to begin to expand how they respond to life. One thing that was mentioned, we've been dealing with loss a lot today. I might just give a little sort of preview of coming attractions. I think when Nicole was on here, she mentioned that I'll be coming back or coming to Tupten Kungaling in September. I'll be there with you all at the center. I am planning to do a full day on grief. I've done this before, and we don't do so much around grief in Buddhism. And I think it's really useful to spend some time talking about grief in whatever way it manifests. Don't feel, by the way, that you have to have gone through some sort of major episode of grief to come to something like that. We all deal with grief. Grief is a constant because of loss being a constant, because we're continually losing, whatever it is in our lives. It can be physical things, it can be vitality, it can be health, it can be, certainly that, losing others in our life who we are very dear to. So recognize that, again, grief is another animal that we need to talk about, and we'll go into that in more detail when I'm there with all of you for a full Saturday workshop. So any questions or comments from today? Got about 5 minutes or so. If anybody had anything or anything you wanted to share. Yeah, Tal, please.
Thank you for the wonderful teaching.
Oh, you're welcome, Tal.
I'm just curious. I know a lot of people who seem actually hyper aware of mortality and death, including myself. But what it is like this self-grasping fear of it and all the anxiety around it. And I know that that's not what Rinpoche means when he's talking about the wholesome fear, or really incorporating a contemplation of death into one's everyday life. But I was just wondering if you could comment on that, because sometimes doing the practices like the 8-stage death meditation and other practices can be very helpful, but sometimes it can make those fears a little worse, I think. So I was just wondering, how should one deal with these fears that come up
I think
in the Buddhist context?
Right. No, I think as you're pointing out, Tal, maybe at those times, it might be first advisable to back away from it a little bit so that we are not sort of become hyper vigilant around it. And again, I do have to say, though, that the whole purpose of engaging in particularly the analysis of these 8 dissolutions and to really examine them and to see what happens at death is to lessen the fear, to really diminish the fear, because we become more familiar with the process. It's kind of like, it's a kind of strange analogy, but say you were going to go to India for your first time. I actually have never been to India. I haven't had that good fortune yet, but I've been to Nepal, similar country and what have you. But you're going to a foreign country where you don't know so much about what's going to happen. And say you're able to talk to somebody who said, well, yeah, you're going to fly into Delhi. Well, I flew into Delhi, and this is what happened when I got there. I had to go here and do this, and the taxis were there, and the hotel that I stayed at was this, and then this is how I got set up to be able to do this pilgrimage here and to do whatever. You had somebody who spelled it all out for you. You would have a lot less fear, hopefully. You wouldn't get on the plane with so much trepidation about, oh, what is it going to be like going to this country where I have no idea where I am and what's happening, and I'm going to be jet lagged and whatever. I think the purpose behind these meditations is to reduce the fear, but maybe the initial advice is back away from it a little bit and instead meditate on something that gives you greater inspiration, that kind of relieves a little bit of that fear. Sort of one of the main, more inspiring meditations is to meditate on Buddha nature, for example, on the reality that all of us have the potential to completely develop ourselves. And this is the guiding force of why we're doing all of these other meditations, is to be able to become fully awakened. Or meditate and feel very inspired by meditating on Refuge in the 3 Jewels, or on the preciousness of this human life, or other things that kind of uplift the mind a little bit, so that when you go back to the meditation, you don't have you have a slightly different context for how you're approaching it, because you're seeing the value of this life, the potential that you have to become a Buddha, and so on. So you have a little bit different framework for why you're examining the death process and what have you. But I don't know, those are kind of the general advice I give to people who are beginning to experience a bit of fear around it, is to move it into the avenue of it becoming more wholesome by recognizing that it's not just this meditation and that's all we're going to engage in. It's couched within a whole set of other meditations that are a part of the Lam Rim that reinforce the overall purpose of life and what we're trying to accomplish. I don't know, does that give some idea of how to work with that?
Yes, it does. It does. Thank you. I think that with these death fears, they're irrational fears, right? To some degree, so they're not necessarily assuaged by a
Yeah,
logical explanation or
yeah,
even, you know what I mean? But
sure.
it does certainly help, and I have been advised, stay away from it if you need to, but not for too long. You have
Yeah,
to eventually
yeah,
incorporate it.
yeah.
But thank you.
It is important not to let it go completely. It was interesting. Just a few days ago, I was invited to do a brief little talk, a chat with a group here that's called Santa Fe Doorways, and it tends to be older people, but it's people who are confronting the reality of death in their lives. And there happened to be one man there as well who works with people with Alzheimer's. I think one of our fears we have around death is that we're also not going to have our mental capital capabilities when we approach death, that we're going to lose a lot of that and what have you. And so again, I think that it was interesting in my discussion with him, and he kind of validated this. He said what he sees in people he works with Alzheimer's is that those things that were much stronger within their lives and tend to be oftentimes even the more positive are what tend to still be there, still be present with somebody, even when they have lost a lot of their normal functioning and capacity, memory, and what have you. So I said, well, yeah, in a Buddhist terms, we would say what we do with this life makes a difference, because if we should have some diminishment in our memory and what have you, that's what's going to be there probably most prominently, is what we've spent most of our time doing, how we've actually been more dedicated to the positive thinking and the qualities that we're trying to cultivate. All of that will be there to rely upon still. I have no doubt. And so I would say the same thing with regard to the death process. It should give us greater impetus to do what we can to embrace more positive concepts throughout this life, so that we have those to rely upon through the process of all this dissolution happening and what have you. We recall Tonglen, or we recall compassion, all these various things. We would think about our teachers. I mean, all these positive thoughts, we have to become familiar with them now, so that we then have them to draw upon whatever we have to confront through aging, through death, etc. So again, that's another way to think about it, is to just recognize that, yes, if you're touching on some of that fear, recognize that that's also to move us into the response to that fear, which is to do something meaningful now, to do what we can to become familiar with all of the positive things we need to rely upon later. So
Thank you. Thanks.
you're welcome. Thank you, Tom. Anyone else have anything? We're just a minute or so over. Can take another question. Any questions in the Gompa? No? Okay. So I'm going to share just one little kind of quote at the end here. And this is actually from the verse from Essential Nectar. Some of you might be familiar with this text. It's a Lam Rim text, but it's in verse form. And this is the verse that's sort of at the conclusion of the death awareness meditation. In that it says, therefore, I now must turn my back upon dreamlike, worthless activities of this life, and through the Lam Rim, essence of the Dharma, strive for the glorious state of enlightenment. Please inspire me so that I can do this. If anything, this is sort of the takeaway from all of this in a Mahayana vein, is that we want to let go of sort of the meaningless things of this life, the chaff, as they often say, and really get to the heart of all of it, the grain that we actually want to carry forward, which is our dedication to practicing well, to using the Lam Rim in order to achieve enlightenment as quickly as possible for the sake of all beings. So let's do two little dedication prayers. Again, the first 4 lines pertain to this idea of dedicating all that we've done for that result of our own enlightenment, the enlightenment of all beings. And then the last 4 lines pertaining to this mind of bodhicitta that we are striving to grow and develop and to never let decline. And we make that strong aspiration for ourselves to have that, as well as for all beings, to have a mind of bodhicitta that continues to grow and develop. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And let's dedicate also for the good health and long lives of all of our precious gurus, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, all the other teachers that we and others are connected to, so we can continue to benefit from their presence in this world and in all our future lives. We also can dedicate for those beings that we're holding in our heart right now, Although we want to always think about all beings, the ones that are in our lives and that whose situation moves us are important for us to work with because we have a karmic connection with them. And we want to think very strongly about sending all of this positive energy we've created out to them to relieve their suffering instantly and to cause them to have all the results of perfect enlightenment, everything that will support them on that path of achieving that. Thank you all very much. One thing just popped into my mind. One nice thing that Larry Rosenberg shares in his book about living in the light of death is this idea of, he said one night he sat and he watched one of these old black and white movies and he made it a contemplation on death about how like everyone he was seeing, all the actors, like if it's like Clark Gable or Humphrey Bogart or whoever, I mean, all these various old actors, that every one of them was dead. All the people in the credits were dead. Everything, about this film, you're watching like an artifact from the past, everyone being dead. We can do death meditation anywhere, by just looking at things and recognizing that, yeah, I mean, it's a part of life. Everyone eventually having to face that reality. Anyway, I thought I'd share that. I thought it was a very, if you're going to sit down and watch TV or some movie or something later today, you can think about that. Maybe you're still dealing with more current films where everyone's still alive, but you can think about how every one of them is going to die without a doubt. So, all right, everyone. On that cheerful note, have a good week. Please do stay safe and healthy. And next week, I think my topic, do you know my topic, Patty? Do you? I can't remember what it is right now in the moment.
I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. I know Buddha's
power of listening.
Oh, power of listening. Okay,
The power
good.
of listening.
Good. So I hope you
Thank
can join
you.
me for that too. Again, an opportunity to look at the other side of our communication with others. We tend to focus a lot on our speaking, but we'll talk about listening and how we can enhance our listening and make that a more powerful skill in our relationships with others. So, all right, everyone, have a good week. Take care now. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
welcome. Thank you, Patty.
John.
Okay, thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
John.